The ground shakes. A mile away, dishes rattle in kitchen cabinets. Windows vibrate in their frames. Dogs start barking across the entire neighborhood. And inside the forge, 125 tons of iron fall onto white-hot steel with a force that registers on seismographs 3 counties over. Sparks explode outward in every direction. The sound isn't just loud, it's a physical thing. It hits your chest like a punch. It rattles your teeth. It makes your vision blur for just a moment as your skull vibrates with the impact. The men standing 10 feet away don't flinch. They've learned not to, because flinching means losing focus, and losing focus in this building means dying. This is Tuesday. This is Wednesday. This is every single working day at the Bethlehem Steel Company Forge in South Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. The year is 1893, and you are standing next to the largest steam hammer ever built on American soil. Picture yourself there. You're a forge worker named Thomas Kearns. You're 34 years old. You immigrated from County Cork 12 years ago with nothing but the clothes on your back and a letter of introduction to a cousin who worked at the iron company. You've been working at Bethlehem Steel for 6 years now, and you still haven't gotten used to the hammer. Nobody does. The old-timers say that's a good thing. The moment you stop respecting the hammer is the moment the hammer kills you. Your job today is simple. Simple to describe anyway. You're part of a crew positioning a 12-ton ingot of white-hot steel beneath the hammer's face. The ingot glows orange-yellow at its core, fading to cherry red at the edges, with patches of black scale already forming on its cooling surface. It came out of the furnace 20 minutes ago, at over 2,000 degrees. It's cooling rapidly. Every second matters. And if it cools too much before the hammer shapes it, the entire piece becomes scrap. 12 tons of steel, 4 days of furnace time, 8 men's labor, $300 in materials, wasted because someone moved too slow. So you move fast, but not too fast, because the tongs you're holding weigh 40 pounds and your arms are already burning from the last ingot. Because the steel wants to roll, and 12 tons of rolling metal will crush anything in its path like a man stepping on a beetle. Because the floor is slick with oil and scale and the remnants of 1,000 previous forgings. Because one wrong step puts you directly under the hammer's path. And that hammer weighs 125 tons, and it's about to fall. The foreman raises his hand. The signal. Everyone freezes in position. You can hear the hiss of steam building pressure in the cylinder above. You can hear the creak of the massive framework settling. You can hear your own heartbeat pounding in your ears, loud enough that you wonder if the man next to you can hear it too. And then the hammer falls. This is the story of how one machine forged 50,000 tons of steel, armed America's Navy, and shook the earth so hard that people a mile away knew exactly when the workday started. This is the story of the men who stood beside it, the men who fed it ingots and shaped battleship armor, and went deaf from the noise, and sometimes died when things went wrong. This is the story of the Bethlehem hammer. To understand why Bethlehem Steel needed a hammer this massive, you need to understand what America was trying to build in the 1880s. And more importantly, you need to understand what America couldn't build. Because the problem wasn't ambition, the problem was capability. The United States Navy was an embarrassment. That's not an exaggeration. That's not dramatic license. That's what the Naval War Board called it in their 1883 report to Congress. After the Civil War, the American fleet had been neglected for nearly 2 decades. The ironclads that had won the war were rusting at anchor in Navy yards from Boston to Norfolk. The wooden frigates were literally rotting in place, their hulls soft with decay, their rigging falling apart. Nobody had built a new warship of any consequence since 1865. Meanwhile, European powers were building modern steel warships, with armored hulls and rifled guns that could hit targets from miles away. The British Royal Navy had dozens of modern battleships patrolling every ocean. The French were experimenting with torpedo boats and armored cruisers. Even smaller nations, like Italy and Austria-Hungary, had steel fleets that could outgun anything America possessed. A Spanish naval commander famously joked that his country's fleet could shell New York City, level the harbor defenses, burn the waterfront to the ground, and be back in Havana sipping rum before the American Navy even raised steam. He wasn't entirely wrong. The U.S. Navy in 1883 ranked 12th in the world, behind Chile, behind Turkey, behind China. The most powerful industrial nation on Earth had a navy that couldn't protect its own coastline. Congress finally authorized construction of new steel warships in 1883. The ABCD ships, they called them: Atlanta, Boston, Chicago, Dolphin. The beginning of what would eventually become the Great White Fleet, the start of American naval power as we understand it today. But here was the problem, the fundamental, impossible problem that nobody in Washington wanted to talk about publicly. The problem that kept Navy secretaries awake at night and made admirals draft angry memos that went nowhere. America didn't know how to make naval armor. Naval armor in the 1880s wasn't just thick steel plate. You couldn't just pour some iron into a mold and bolt it onto a ship's hull and call it protection. Naval armor was a specific kind of steel, manufactured through processes that European foundries had spent decades perfecting through trial and error and closely guarded secrets. It had to be forged under immense pressure to eliminate internal voids that could become fracture points. It had to be hardened through a precise chemical treatment that case-hardened the face while leaving the back ductile enough to absorb impact without shattering. It had to be shaped to exact specifications, with mounting points and bolt holes in precise locations that matched the shipyard drawings. The British had this technology. Their foundries at Sheffield and Birmingham had been making armor plate since the Crimean War, improving it with each generation of warships. The French had it at Le Creusot and Saint-Chamond. The Germans had it at Krupp in Essen, the largest steelworks in the world, where they were developing new hardening processes that would make their armor the best on Earth. America had to buy its armor plate from them. Every plate, for every ship, at whatever price they chose to charge. Think about what that meant. The United States of America, the most powerful industrial nation on Earth, the country that had laid more railroad track than the rest of the world combined, the country that produced more steel than Britain and Germany together, could not manufacture steel strong enough to protect its own warships. Every time Congress authorized a new cruiser or battleship, the Navy Department had to go hat in hand to European foundries and beg them to sell armor plate. The humiliation was compounded by the practical implications. If America went to war with any European power, its armor supply would be cut off immediately. Every warship under construction would be frozen in place, sitting in dry dock, waiting for armor that would never arrive. The fleet would be limited to whatever ships were already completed and armored. No reinforcements, no replacements. No new construction until the war ended. And even if America could somehow learn to make that steel, there was another problem that nobody knew how to solve. Nobody in the country had equipment big enough to forge it. Naval armor plates for a modern battleship were enormous. 20 feet long, 10 feet wide, 18 inches thick at the belt line, where enemy shells were most likely to strike. A single plate could weigh over 40 tons. And that plate had to be forged, not cast. The difference matters enormously, and it's worth understanding why. Cast steel is poured into a mold and allowed to cool. It's how you make engine blocks and manhole covers, and ornamental railings, and 1,000 other everyday objects. Casting is relatively simple and relatively cheap. You melt the metal, pour it into a shaped mold, let it cool, and you have your finished piece. But cast steel has microscopic voids and weaknesses scattered throughout its structure. Air bubbles that get trapped during pouring, inclusions of slag or impurities, tiny cracks that form as the metal shrinks during cooling. For most applications, these flaws don't matter. A cast engine block works fine, even with minor internal defects. A cast manhole cover will hold up under traffic for decades, despite its imperfections. For armor that needs to stop a 12-inch shell traveling at 2,000 feet per second, those weaknesses become catastrophic fracture points. Hit a cast plate with a heavy shell, and the shock wave propagates through the metal until it finds a void, or a crack, or an inclusion. Then the plate shatters. It doesn't dent or deform, it explodes into fragments. And those fragments become secondary projectiles inside the ship, killing everyone nearby. Forged steel is different. You take a solid ingot, heated to white-hot malleability, and you beat it. You compress it. You hammer it while it's soft, blow after blow, forcing the molecular structure into alignment, squeezing out voids, welding together any internal cracks, creating a grain structure that runs through the entire piece, like the grain in good hardwood. Forged steel doesn't shatter under impact. It deforms, it dents, it absorbs the impact energy and spreads it across the entire plate, rather than concentrating it at a single fracture point. But forging a 40-ton armor plate requires equipment that simply didn't exist in America. The biggest steam hammer in the country in 1885 was a 15-ton unit at the Midvale Steel Company in Philadelphia. 15 tons of falling weight. It could forge locomotive axles. It could make small cannon barrels. It could shape structural beams for bridges and buildings. Armor plate for a modern battleship was completely beyond its capability. The mathematics were simple and brutal. To properly forge a 40-ton plate, you needed a hammer delivering at least 10,000 tons of force per blow. Nobody in America had anything close. Joseph Wharton looked at this situation and saw opportunity where others saw only problems. Wharton was already one of the richest men in Pennsylvania. He'd made his first fortune in zinc mining, cornering the American market for spelter and zinc oxide through a combination of aggressive acquisition and patent control. He'd made his second fortune in nickel, controlling the only significant nickel deposits in the United States. By 1885, he controlled the Bethlehem Iron Company, a modest operation in the Lehigh Valley that manufactured railroad rails, structural beams, and small forgings for the locomotive industry. But Wharton understood markets better than most men alive. He understood that the real money wasn't in rails. The railroad boom was slowing as the major trunk lines were completed. Competition was fierce. Profit margins were thin and getting thinner every year. The real money, the transformative money, the fortune-building money, was in government contracts. And the biggest government contracts for the foreseeable future were going to whoever could make naval armor. The Navy Department was desperate. They were willing to pay premium prices for domestic armor, prices that would have seemed outrageous for any other product. They were willing to provide technical assistance, to share intelligence gathered from European sources, to send officers to observe European forging operations. They were willing to guarantee contracts years in advance, providing the financial security that made major capital investment possible. All they needed was someone willing to build the facilities, someone with enough capital, enough vision, and enough courage to take the risk. Wharton authorized the construction of a new forge facility at Bethlehem. The centerpiece would be a steam hammer larger than anything ever built in the Western Hemisphere, larger than anything in Britain, larger than anything in France. The biggest hammer in the world outside of the Krupp works in Germany. The man he put in charge of building it was John Fritz. If you've never heard of John Fritz, you're not alone. He's one of the most important figures in American industrial history, and he's almost completely forgotten today. No statues in public parks, no national holidays, no schools or universities named after him. Just a small plaque at the Bethlehem site that most visitors walk past without noticing, on their way to the casino that now occupies the old forge buildings. Fritz didn't invent the steam hammer. That credit goes to James Nasmyth, a Scottish engineer working in Manchester, England. Nasmyth built the first practical steam hammer in 1839, designed to forge paddle wheel shafts for the new generation of ocean-going steamships. His design was elegant in its simplicity. Steam pressure lifted a heavy weight, called the tup, to the top of its stroke. Then the steam was released, and gravity brought the weight crashing down onto the workpiece below. The weight of the tup determined the force of the blow. The height of the stroke determined the impact velocity. Simple physics, brilliantly applied. What Fritz did was scale it beyond anything Nasmyth had imagined possible. Nasmyth's original hammer had a falling weight of about 5 tons. Revolutionary for its time, certainly. It could shape pieces that would have taken days of hand forging in a matter of hours. It transformed the shipbuilding industry and earned Nasmyth a fortune. But by the 1880s, American industry needed something far larger. 10 times larger, 20 times larger. Large enough to forge armor plate that would stop any shell afloat. Fritz had been superintendent at Bethlehem Iron since 1860. He was 63 years old by the time Wharton gave him the naval forge project, with thinning hair and a thick white beard and eyes that still burned with the intensity of a man half his age. Most men 63 would have been thinking about retirement, about grandchildren, about quiet evenings on the porch. Fritz was thinking about how to build the largest machine of its kind ever constructed on American soil. He'd spent 40 years solving problems that other engineers said couldn't be solved. He'd invented the 3-high rolling mill that made Bethlehem's fortune in railroad rails. He'd designed blast furnaces that produced more iron per day than any competitors. He'd developed techniques for making Bessemer steel that were adopted by foundries across the country. The man understood iron and steel the way a sculptor understands clay, intuitively and completely. The problem with building a bigger steam hammer wasn't just the hammer itself. Anyone with enough money could design a bigger cylinder, a heavier tup, a taller frame. The problem was everything around the hammer. The problem was physics. A steam hammer works on simple principles. Steam pressure lifts a heavy weight to the top of its stroke. The steam releases. Gravity accelerates that weight downward. The weight strikes whatever you're forging, delivering its kinetic energy into the workpiece. The heavier the weight, the more energy it delivers. That's straightforward. A 100-ton weight falling from 10 feet delivers roughly 5 times the energy of a 20-ton weight falling from the same height. But here's what most people don't consider. That energy doesn't just go into the steel you're forging. Newton's third law, which every school child learns and most adults forget, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. 125 tons falling from a height of 12 feet delivers a blow of approximately 15,000 tons of force. That force goes down through the workpiece, through the anvil, through the foundation, and into the earth itself. The ground shakes, buildings tremble, and if your foundation isn't strong enough to absorb that force, the hammer destroys itself within weeks. The anvil block cracks, the foundation crumbles, the building shakes apart. Men die in the collapse. Fritz's solution was to build the largest single piece of iron ever cast in America. The anvil block for the Bethlehem hammer weighed 475 tons. Think about that number. 475 tons of solid iron, cast in a single continuous pour that required draining 3 blast furnaces simultaneously into a mold the size of a small house. The mold alone took 6 weeks to construct from specially made fire bricks and reinforced iron bands. The casting took 17 hours of continuous work, with crews rotating in shifts around the clock to keep the pour going. Because if you stopped pouring before the mold was full, the iron already in the mold would begin to solidify, and you'd end up with seams and weaknesses that would destroy the anvil under the hammer's impact. That anvil block was sunk 30 feet into bedrock. Not 30 feet into soil, which would compress and shift under repeated impact. 30 feet into the solid granite that underlies the Lehigh Valley. Crews spent 4 months drilling and blasting that hole, hauling away thousands of tons of broken rock in carts pulled by teams of horses. Then they filled the bottom with 20 feet of compacted gravel and concrete, creating a foundation within a foundation, a cushion that would absorb and distribute the hammer's force. The block itself rested on this base, its top surface ground and polished to perfect levelness, its mass so great that the surrounding earth compressed measurably when it was lowered into place. Surveying teams measured the settlement. The ground sank almost 2 inches in a circle extending 50 feet from the anvil pit. The building around the hammer had to be designed from the ground up to handle the vibration. Standard industrial construction, the heavy timber frames and brick walls that worked for ordinary factories, would shake itself apart within weeks under that pounding. Fritz specified an all-steel framework with flexible joints that could absorb vibration without cracking. The building's foundations were isolated from the hammer's foundation by trenches filled with sand and cork, creating a shock absorber that prevented the vibration from traveling into the walls and bringing them down. The roof structure was designed to flex without breaking. The floor plates were mounted on springs. Even the windows were set in rubber gaskets to prevent the glass from shattering with each blow. The hammer itself was assembled over 18 months of painstaking work. The main cylinder, 9 feet in diameter and 20 feet tall, was forged in sections and bolted together with fasteners the size of a man's arm. The piston rod alone weighed 12 tons and had to be machined to tolerances of a few thousandths of an inch, despite its massive size. The guides that kept the falling weight aligned were 40 feet tall and machined on both faces to ensure the tup fell perfectly straight, without wobble or drift that could throw the blow off-center. When the Bethlehem hammer was completed in 1891, engineers from across the country came to see it. They arrived by train from Pittsburgh and Chicago, from Philadelphia and New York, from as far away as San Francisco. They stood in the forge building and craned their necks upward at the massive framework, at the cylinder disappearing into the shadows near the roof, at the tup hanging motionless above the anvil like the suspended judgment of an angry god. They couldn't quite believe what Fritz had built. Nothing in their experience had prepared them for the scale of it. The first test firing happened on a cold morning in November 1891. The crew had loaded a 10-ton ingot of test steel onto the anvil surface. The metal glowed orange-white, fresh from the soaking pit, radiating heat that made everyone step back despite the cold air outside. Steam from their breath mixed with steam from the cylinder above. The foreman signaled. Steam hissed into the cylinder. The tup began to rise, slowly at first, then faster as the steam pressure built. The chains and guides creaked under the strain. At the top of its stroke, 12 feet above the anvil, the tup paused. In that moment of silence, you could hear pigeons cooing in the rafters far above. You could hear the creak of the building settling around you. You could hear men breathing. Then the foreman pulled the release lever. The tup fell. Not fast, exactly. Something that weighs 125 tons doesn't accelerate the way a baseball does. The air resistance alone would slow a smaller object. But it accelerated enough. 10 feet per second. 20. 30. And when it hit, the sound was unlike anything those engineers had ever heard before. One witness described it as standing inside thunder. Another said it felt like the earth had coughed. A third wrote in his diary that the impact had somehow existed in his chest before his ears registered the sound, as if the shockwave had hit him physically before it became audible. The floor of the forge jumped 6 inches. Tools fell off benches 200 feet away. In the town of South Bethlehem, nearly a mile from the works, people ran out of their houses, convinced an earthquake had struck. Dishes fell from shelves, pictures dropped from walls, church bells rang from the vibration alone. And on the anvil, the ingot had flattened like bread dough under a rolling pin. 12 inches thick became 4 inches thick in a single blow. The steel had squished outward, filling the spaces around it, deforming exactly as Fritz had predicted. The Bethlehem hammer worked. Over the next decade, that hammer would forge more naval armor than any other machine in America. Every battleship that joined the fleet before 1900 wore Bethlehem steel. The face-hardened plates for the USS Iowa, 18 inches thick and harder than anything afloat. The barbette armor for the USS Massachusetts, shaped in curves that would deflect incoming shells like a stone skipping off water. The turret plates for the USS Indiana, steel so thick and hard that no gun then afloat could penetrate it at combat range. Each piece of armor started as an ingot. The ingots came from Bethlehem's open hearth furnaces, massive brick-lined vessels that could melt 50 tons of steel at a time. Iron ore and limestone and coke went in one end, fed by crews working around the clock. Molten steel, refined and alloyed to precise specifications, came out the other end in a white-hot stream. The molten steel was poured into molds, each mold carefully designed to produce an ingot of the right shape and size for its intended purpose. The steel solidified slowly, taking hours or even days to cool enough to handle. Slow cooling was critical. Cool the steel too fast, and internal stresses would build up, creating weaknesses that would only reveal themselves later when a shell struck the finished armor. Once solid, the ingots were transferred to soaking pits, gas-fired furnaces that reheated them to forging temperature. The reheating took hours. The steel had to be hot all the way through, not just on the surface. An ingot that was hot outside but cool inside would crack catastrophically when the hammer struck it. Moving a 40-ton ingot from the soaking pit to the hammer was an operation that required perfect coordination between a dozen men and several pieces of heavy equipment working in precise synchronization. Overhead cranes, themselves steam-powered, lowered massive tongs toward the glowing steel. Crews attached chains, working quickly because every second the ingot sat in open air, it was cooling. The crane lifted the ingot clear of the pit, swinging it through the air, and everyone scattered out of the way. A 40-ton ingot glowing at 2,000 degrees is not something you want to be near. The radiant heat was intense enough to blister exposed skin from 20 feet away. Men wore heavy leather aprons and face shields, but even so, working close to the steel was brutal. Eyebrows singed, hair caught fire if you got too close. The air shimmered and danced like the air above a highway in summer. At the hammer, the crew positioned the ingot using long-handled tools and sheer muscle. The tongs weighed hundreds of pounds. The leverage was awkward. The ingot wanted to roll, to tip, to move in ways that could crush anyone in its path. Communication was by hand signal because the noise of the forge made speech impossible. The hammer operator stood at his control station, a small platform to one side of the anvil, protected from sparks and scale by a metal shield. He watched the foreman's signals. He watched the ingot. He watched the tup hanging above, waiting for the moment when everything was aligned. Then he worked the controls. Steam into the cylinder, tup rising, release, impact. The hammer rose and fell in a rhythm that the workers learned to anticipate. Between blows they moved in, repositioning the ingot, rotating it, building up the shape gradually. Each blow spread the steel slightly. Each blow pushed it closer to its final form. A single armor plate might require 200 blows over 6 hours of continuous work, the ingot returning to the soaking pit multiple times to be reheated when it cooled too much. The heat was unbearable. That's not an exaggeration or a figure of speech. The heat was literally beyond what the human body could bear for extended periods. Temperatures at the anvil surface exceeded 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The radiant heat raised air temperature throughout the forge to well over 100 degrees even in winter. Even with massive ventilators pulling hot air up and out of the building, even with doors open at both ends to create cross-ventilation, the interior of the forge during operation was hotter than any desert. Men worked in 20-minute shifts. That was the maximum anyone could endure. After 20 minutes beside that hammer, you retreated to cooling stations near the doors, where you drank salt water to replace what you'd sweated out, and you sat with your head between your knees and waited for your heart rate to drop back toward normal. Then you went back in. Even in January, with snow piling up outside the forge doors, the interior was 110 degrees. In summer, it was worse. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion regularly, sometimes several per shift. The company employed full-time medical staff just to deal with heat prostration cases, dragging unconscious workers out of the forge and cooling them down with wet blankets and ice. The noise destroyed hearing. That's not metaphor. It's not poetic license. It's documented medical fact that the company's own doctors noted in their records. Men who worked the hammer for more than a few years went substantially deaf. The company knew it. The workers knew it. Everyone accepted it as the price of the job, as unavoidable as calluses on a laborer's hands. Their wives learned to face them when speaking, so they could read lips. Their children learned to shout. By the time they retired, if they lived that long, many couldn't hear normal conversation at all. They sat in silence, watching a world they could no longer participate in fully, cut off from casual conversation, from music, from the small sounds that make life rich. And the danger. Every blow of the hammer sent sparks and scale flying in all directions. Scale is the oxide layer that forms on hot steel, a thick crust of iron oxide that builds up on the surface when steel is heated to forging temperature. When the hammer struck, that scale exploded off the ingot in a shower of fragments. Those fragments were sharp as glass. They were red hot, and they traveled fast. Men wore leather aprons that hung from neck to knee. They wore leather hoods that covered their heads and shoulders. They wore thick gloves and heavy boots, but the protection was never complete. Scale found its way through gaps. Sparks landed on exposed skin. Burns were constant, ranging from minor annoyances that healed in days to serious injuries that left permanent scars. I found records in the Northampton County Archives, death certificates, coroner's reports, company incident files that somehow survived when so much else was lost to fire and flood and simple neglect. Between 1891 and 1905, 17 men died at the Bethlehem Forge. 17 men who went to work one morning and never came home to their families. Some were killed by falling equipment. A chain broke under stress it shouldn't have faced. A tong slipped from heat-softened leather. A crane dropped its load when a cable failed. Some were crushed between ingots and walls, caught in spaces that closed suddenly when the steel moved in unexpected ways. Some simply collapsed from heat exhaustion and were dead before they reached the hospital, their hearts giving out from the strain of working in temperatures that would kill an ordinary man in minutes. 3 were killed by the hammer itself, caught under the tup when it fell. Nothing left to bury except what could be scraped off the anvil and collected in a bucket. One death in particular stayed with me long after I closed the archive folder. A man named William Novak. He was 26 years old. He'd immigrated from Bohemia 3 years earlier, worked his way up from common laborer at the rail yard to forge hand at the hammer. He'd been at Bethlehem for just 3 months when it happened. He'd recently married a girl named Anna Bartosova, also from Bohemia, who he'd met at a church social in South Bethlehem. She had dark hair and a quick smile, according to the one photograph that survives. By August of 1897, she was 5 months pregnant with their first child. On the afternoon of August 12th, William was helping position a 30-ton ingot for its final passes under the hammer. The ingot had been worked for several hours already. It was approaching its final shape. The crew was tired from a long shift. It was late afternoon. The heat was at its daily peak. His foot slipped on the oil-soaked floor plates. He fell forward, arms windmilling, trying to catch his balance. He reached out his hands to break his fall, and his hands, his arms, his upper body fell against the ingot's surface. The steel was 1,800 degrees. He was pulled away immediately. His crewmates grabbed him by the belt and the collar and dragged him back, their own hands burning from contact with his smoldering clothes. They carried him to the medical station, running, shouting for the doctor. But the damage was done. Burns over 60% of his body. Third-degree burns on his hands, his arms, his face, his chest. The skin was gone, replaced by blackened tissue that the doctors debrided in an operation that took 4 hours. He died 3 days later. He never regained consciousness enough to speak. He never said goodbye to Anna. He never saw his daughter, born that December, who grew up knowing her father only from a single photograph taken on his wedding day. The company paid his funeral expenses. They gave Anna $200. That was standard at the time. That was considered generous. $200 for a husband. $200 for a father who would never hold his child. Anna remarried 2 years later to another Bethlehem worker, a man named Kowalski, who adopted her daughter and gave her his name. She lived to be 81. I found her death record from 1952. She outlived William Novak by 55 years. And I wonder sometimes what she remembered, whether she ever walked past the forge after it closed, whether she thought about that August afternoon when she heard the whistle blow and knew something had gone wrong. The men who survived the forge didn't fare much better in the long run. The combination of noise exposure, heat stress, and constant physical labor broke their bodies down by their 50s. Many developed what we would now recognize as industrial lung disease, from breathing forge smoke and metal particles for years on end. The air in the forge was full of vaporized iron, carbon dust, and combustion products. Men coughed constantly. Many developed chronic respiratory conditions that shortened their lives by decades. Many had arthritis so severe they could barely walk by the time they reached 50. The constant heavy lifting, the awkward positions required to manipulate forgings, the shock transmitted through tools when the hammer struck. All of it wore out joints and connective tissue years before their time. Almost all of them were deaf. That was universal. Work the hammer for 5 years and you'd lose significant hearing. Work it for 10 and you'd be substantially deaf. Work it for 20 and you'd be lucky to hear thunder. They made $2.50 a day, top wages for industrial work in the 1890s. Skilled men in dangerous trades could command premium pay, and forge work was about as dangerous and skilled as industrial labor got. $2.50 a day was enough to rent a small house in the ethnic neighborhoods of South Bethlehem, enough to buy food and coal, enough for new clothes for the children occasionally. Not enough to compensate for what the work took from them. Not even close. But they did the work. Day after day, year after year, they stood beside that hammer and positioned ingots and breathed forge smoke and went death by inches. They forged the steel that armored America's Navy. When the USS Oregon raced around Cape Horn during the Spanish-American War, covering 14,000 miles in 66 days to join the fleet at Cuba, her armor plates had been hammered into shape by men like William Novak. When the Great White Fleet sailed around the world in 1907, showing American power to every nation on Earth, those white-painted hulls were protected by Bethlehem steel. The workers never saw those ships in action. Most of them never saw the ocean. They were born in landlocked regions of Europe. They came to America seeking better lives, and they found the forge. They just saw the ingots and the hammer, and the endless production schedule that kept the forge running 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. Joseph Wharton became one of the richest men in America. He endowed the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. His name is carved in stone. William Novak's name is in a coroner's report that nobody opens. The great hammer didn't forge just armor plate. Between naval contracts, it forged cannon barrels for coast defense guns. Some were over 30 feet long, capable of throwing a half-ton shell 5 miles. The forging process was even more demanding than armor plate. Any weakness and the barrel would explode when fired. The hammer forged locomotive axles for the Pennsylvania Railroad. Each axle had to bear a 200-ton locomotive traveling at 60 miles per hour. Lives depended on every blow. By 1900, the hammer had processed over 50,000 tons of steel, 100 million pounds of metal, shaped by steam and gravity and forgotten labor. But the age of the steam hammer was ending. The problem was inherent to the design. A hammer delivers force instantaneously. The surface of the steel responds before the interior. You get internal stresses, microscopic fractures. Hydraulic presses solved this. A press squeezes slowly, over 30 seconds. The steel flows evenly. The finished product is stronger. By 1903, Bethlehem had installed its own hydraulic press. Within a decade, the hammer was relegated to roughing work. The transition replaced thunder with a whisper. For the workers, the change was mixed. The press was safer, but the jobs were changing. A steam hammer required skilled men. The press required fewer workers, more automation, less craft. This pattern would repeat throughout American industry. Machines that made work safer also made workers replaceable. Some adapted. Many aged out. They reached their 50s with broken bodies and no place in the modern steelworks. The hammer continued into the 1930s. By World War II, it was mostly idle. Bethlehem Steel declined over the 20th century. The last plant closed in 1995. Bankruptcy in 2001. But the hammer's anvil is still there. I visited a few years ago. The old forge is now a casino. Slot machines where the soaking pits used to be. But the anvil block remains. Too heavy to move. 475 tons sunk in bedrock. They built around it. It sits behind glass now, between the casino and a chain restaurant. There's a plaque about Bethlehem Steel. It mentions John Fritz. It doesn't mention William Novak. I stood there a long time. Tourists walked past, slot machines chimed, air conditioning hummed at 72 degrees. I tried to imagine the heat, the noise, the pride of forging steel that would protect sailors on the other side of the world. All gone now. The hammer scrapped, the forge cold, the workers dead, their grandchildren scattered. But the anvil remains, 475 tons, waiting for a hammer that will never fall. Here's what I keep coming back to. We look at machines of the past and see engineering triumphs. We marvel at what our ancestors built. But those machines required human bodies, human sacrifice. The Bethlehem hammer was a marvel. 125 tons of falling weight. It forged steel that armored our Navy, projected American power across oceans. And it did this by consuming the health, the hearing, the lives of the men who operated it. I don't say this to diminish their accomplishment. I say it because their accomplishment is greater than we acknowledge. They accepted risk we can barely comprehend. They traded years of their lives for wages that seem pitiful now. They did it because the work needed doing, because their families needed to eat, because there was pride in shaping steel that would last a century. The USS Indiana served in 2 wars. Her armor was never penetrated. Those plates did exactly what they were designed to do. They brought young men home. That's worth remembering. But so is this. The 17 dead. The hundreds made deaf. The families who got $200 when their husbands didn't come home. We owe both legacies our attention. The triumph and the cost. The steel and the sacrifice. The anvil block weighs 475 tons. It's there because it's too heavy to move, left behind as a demolition problem. And yet it stands as a memorial anyway, accidental, inadequate, surrounded by slot machines, but a memorial nonetheless, a reminder that great works were built by human hands, that machines required human sacrifice, that progress has always had a price. Every warship in the age of steel battleships carried Bethlehem armor. Everyone was protected by men who stood beside that hammer in 2,000-degree heat. We drive past the old mill site. We see a casino. We don't think about what happened there. But the anvil remembers. 475 tons sunk in bedrock, waiting for a hammer that will never fall again.